Hi. Yes, there I am. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, not bad at all. How's this whole situation been treating you?
I think it would be a lie not to say it's been ups and downs. It's a bit like long runs, isn't it? Sometimes there are moments in the long run where you feel like you're really in the pace and everything feels easy and wonderful and joyful, and there are moments where it feels like every step is a nightmare.
And I think that we're all gradually adjusting to the reality that this is not a 10K, it's an ultra.
Yeah, yeah.
This is a mountain 100 miler we're doing right
It,
now.
it,
And
it feels like that. Yes, certainly.
yeah,
I don't feel
and that
prepared
means,
for it.
and that means that there are, yeah, exactly, without any training, plantar fasciitis. Um, but yeah, and that means that there are going to be probably some 3 or 4 hour stretches where we're deep in hell. But the mantra is that it never always gets worse.
That's very true. So I set this up because I just really wanted to chat to you because we've missed out on something because we started communicating because you were bringing your show, The Hills Are Ours. Is that right? That is the right name
These
of it.
hills are ours, yeah.
These Hills Are Ours to Salisbury as part of the International Arts Festival, and I've seen the work and I saw what you were doing, and I thought that looks really interesting. I'd love to see it, and I thought, well, if he's into theatre and running, then maybe we should go for a run. That'd be a good way to do it. And you wrote back and said,
We are planning on doing that with every audience that we visit around the country. Like part of the kind of folie de grandeur of this whole project is that not only will we do a national tour that's quite densely packed, but the morning following every show, we'll go for the kind of run we talk about in the show in the place where the show's taking place. So we'll escape the city to the nearest hill or green or high or wild place.
so that was going to be on the 28th of May. So it would have been on a Friday morning run. So how many of these runs have you missed then in the
We're
process?
now on what will it be? I think now is week 7 or 8 of a 3 month tour. I can't tell you offhand how many gigs and therefore how many runs we'd have done by now, but I'll say it's probably it'll be in the mid to high 20s by now. Right now, we were supposed to be towards the end of a mini tour of Devon, where we were going to start. Devon's the only English county with 2 coastlines, a north
Okay.
coast and a south coast. And we were going to start the mini tour of Devon in Hartland on the north coast of Devon. And we were going to finish the mini tour of Devon in Dartmouth on the south coast of Devon. And we were going to run from show to show over the course of a just under 2 week mini tour. And so the morning after run with the audience would have been
To the
some or
next
all of the
venue.
way to the next gig. And I'm really thinking about that every day at the moment. I was really
Mm.
excited about that. I've done quite a bit of work with Beeford, the arts organisation in North Devon. They co-commissioned the show. They've been big supporters of my work for years. And I was really looking forward to being there again and seeing those communities again and that beautiful landscape. But every time we have a show, it's still in my calendar. And so every day I I look at my calendar and it pops up and I think, oh, we're not in Harrogate today, which I think is where we were coming to Salisbury from.
But you talk about we because you commissioned and you've created the show not on your own, but you've created it with Boff Wally. Is that
That's
right?
right, yeah. Boff and I have worked on the show together. We've worked together on a lot of projects in the past, but it's our first theatre piece together. He's best known as a founder member of Chumbawamba, and he toured with them for, I don't know, nearly 30 years, I think. In the latter years of the band touring together, a couple of them separately gradually moved into script writing and drama and playwriting. Boff wrote several plays. I directed one of them. He wrote a number for the Leeds-based radical theatre company Red Ladder, who I'm on the board of, so I'm really closely connected to them as well. But then Boff and I started working together again about 5 years ago because we applied jointly for a big participatory arts commission through an organisation called People United, whose stated mission is to use the arts to increase the amount of kindness in the world. So we worked in Manchester Museum with People United to create a piece with 120 participants, 5 different choirs, and loads of spoken word performance, pop-up choirs, and just animated this whole museum. And it was just a really wonderful experience that for both of us was quite transformative in our practice. It was a real pivot in. So we both continued what we'd been doing up to that point, but it also brought this whole new thing into our lives, which are these large-scale participatory choir projects. And since that time, we've done another 3 or 4 comparable projects. And whenever we're doing one of these projects, when we're supposed to be talking about work, conversation drifts to running. And there came a point when we said, do you know what? Maybe we should make a piece of work about running. So we started with an idea that we would do some kind of high concept art piece for a choir of runners, which we might yet do, but that morphed into These Hills Are Ours, which is a kind of umbrella title for a number of different artworks in different media, one of which is the theatre piece that you were aware of, but we've also done 2 of a projected series of 4 participatory choir projects on the same themes. So they've been walks from the centre of a town to the top of the peak overlooking that town. Those projects have been turned into short films, which are not just documents of the journey and the song, but also, I think, works of art in their own right. One of those has been released. The second of those is released in the middle of June. The other 2 are, of course, indefinitely postponed. There's also a kind of book project that we're thinking about. So it's this huge, sprawling project all about not just running, although running's central to it, but it's really about the relationship between urban and rural, and it's about escaping the confines of 21st century digital life and running to the hills.
So that's quite interesting, because you talk quite a bit about that, going from the city into the hill, because the show's obviously about that, and that's what the choirs are doing. And I wonder, do you think this is during the Industrial Revolution, there was the whole Right to Roam activity, because of that sense that people were working in these smoggy, horrible cities, and they had the right to go out and get fresh air and be in the countryside? And is that still true, do you think, today, that what we've done is we've shifted from, it's not necessarily working from big smoggy cities, but being stuck behind screens and being stuck in offices, that this is suddenly we need to reclaim that right to be able to get out and capture fresh air? And
yeah, that's absolutely at the core of it. In the show, we talk about the Kindertrespass, which was a mass trespass in 1932 on Kinder Scout in what is now the Peak District, but then was someone's backyard, basically. It was the area around Bleaklow, just north of Kinder Scout, was the largest area in England without a public path. Kinder Scout is the highest point in what is now the Peak District, but you weren't allowed to go up it unless you were invited there by the landowner, probably to shoot grouse. And that whole area, the Peak District, and countless other areas like it up and down the country, were totally inaccessible, and there was no right of access to the countryside. That was entirely dependent on the goodwill of landowners. And the Kindertrespass of 1932 and other actions like it that followed it led to an opening up of the countryside that's to some degree been ongoing since then. The Right to Roam legislation of 99 or 2000 led to an opening up of access quite a way beyond what had been achieved in the 30s. But still, 90% of the rural land in England and Wales remains inaccessible. And more than half of it is owned by 0.06 of the population, 0.06%.
It's a shocking figure, isn't it?
So we've come a long way since the 1920s and 30s, but we've got a hell of a long way to go. And yeah, absolutely. The show is, I mean, I've answered a slightly different question, actually. The show is about the ongoing fight for that freedom. It's also about the fact that it answers the same need, even though the city is now digital rather than industrial.
I suppose the two are interconnected, aren't they? You need that freedom because of the importance of that freedom. It's sort of, you talk in the publicity material for the show about escaping noise as well. Do you think there's something very transformative in the act of movement and running and all those kind of activities? From a personal experience, do you use it in that way in your practice as a space where you can be quiet and think about?
Yeah, I think for me it fills a similar role to that filled by meditation for other people. Um, I often hear people talking about it as a space where you might solve problems or address issues and that sort of thing. And it doesn't never do that for me, but that definitely isn't what it's for me. I think if I go out on a run thinking I'm going to worry about this problem until I solve it while I'm running, then I'm not going to solve it. Um, but what it gives me is a space where I'm not necessarily thinking. It's a space which is about being physically present rather than mentally present. And that means that sometimes my mind wanders away from where I actually am. Sometimes it means I'm hyper present mentally in my body, especially if I'm doing a steep downhill or something like that.
There's quite a few books written about people, how as human beings we're kind of designed to move and designed to run and to do that process. Do you think that it's sort of tapping into a kind of age-old genetically embedded thing, that actually that movement kind of locks into our ancestors and it kind of makes the body feel like it's doing the normal thing?
I mean, I find those things really appealing. And I have a bit of kind of, I don't know, rationalist skepticism about them all the same. I immediately bristle when people talk about, and this is just, I don't know, people don't mean it literally, but you just use that phrase, designed to run. And designed and evolved are obviously very different things. And I'm not a kind of Dawkins-esque anti-theist, but I am not, I don't have a kind of religious theological view of the world. So I immediately bristle when people start talking about, kind of designed or even that our bodies are intended to do this or that or the other. Evolution is a series of flukes. And I'm really grateful to that series of flukes, just like some people are really grateful to their creator. I love the idea that my body has evolved in such a way that running feels like something that is the kind of correct use of this machine, that it feels like the right way to use it. But I love that not because of the sense that I'm somehow that it's endorsing my choices. I love it because of the sense of being part of something much bigger than myself. The idea that my body does this in a way that's barely different to the body of one of my hunter-gatherer ancestors 25,000 years ago. I think that's wonderful. Yeah. That really moves me. I also think that some people just don't experience running like that. And for some, that's because, to start with, it's really hard, because we've all spent years sitting on our asses, and so our glute muscles don't know they exist. And I know some people who get on a bike and feel like this is what their body's designed to do.
Yeah. Which should fit with your story of evolution, which is, maybe they're more evolved than we are.
Well, maybe, yeah. But also, I think it's obviously bonkers to think that your body has evolved to ride a bike, because evolution doesn't take place that quickly. But that feeling is a real one, and I think that feeling is probably the same as the one I have. And I love all the stuff in Born to Run, which is a terrific book, partly because it's kind of pop science, pop sport, written in the style of Raymond Chandler. I love the book. But there are loads of indefensible claims in it. He's no anthropologist, for sure. But I love it. And the stuff in there about, the way the neck muscles only really come into their own when running. I really notice that, if I'm carrying a heavy pack towards the end of a long ultra, and I can feel that those muscles have been doing their work. And the glute muscles aren't really necessary on that scale if walking. And I love all the stuff about, can't remember if the stuff about Pheidippides and all the rest of it is in that book or his next one, which is an even more ludicrously ambitious synthesis of a load of things that frankly have nothing to do with one another. But he's such a persuasive writer that I enjoy it all the same. So I like the grandeur of those claims, while also thinking, it's not going to get through peer review though, is it? But he's a great writer. That's
superb writer.
Because there's an enormous amount of running literature, isn't there? And I guess perhaps like you, I devour all of it. I've got 2 whole shelves of books about running, and that's not counting the ebooks and the ones that that happened to be in my local library.
And all the ones that are loaned out to friends. You really should read this book as well.
Yeah, exactly. And almost all of them, however much I enjoy them, the writing's pretty mediocre. You know, Killian Jornet, I could watch him run downhill for the rest of time, but he's no writer.
It's interesting because we've gone into almost storytelling, and of course that's sort of what your profession is, and I wonder.
And I'm that before I'm a runner, although both go to my bones in different ways. Being a storyteller has been more consistently part of my life. Partly injury is to blame for that, but you can't really be injured as a storyteller unless you lose your voice box.
So we're doing this conversation with me in Salisbury and you in Lancaster, is that right?
Yes.
Because of lockdown, we should talk briefly just about the impact of that on, obviously it's had a horrific impact on the show itself and the touring of the show. How is it for independent theatres? You talked about being on the board of another one. What's the crisis like for those people in terms of how they can deal with it?
I mean, it's a catastrophe. There's no two ways about it. And it's really challenging because we have to recognise an enormous amount of privilege in some ways. Like, we are not frontline workers, but economically, it's catastrophic for the theatre industry. And unless there's some serious government intervention, fairly soon, we're going to start seeing a lot of theatres close their doors permanently. And the industry on the other side of this is going to look very, very different. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the surface of a much bigger problem we're going to lose a lot of people to the industry as well. Everyone's work has been largely or totally cancelled for the foreseeable future, with obvious huge economic impacts on individuals and their families. And coming back out of it on the other side is going to be enormously economically challenging, even if no more theatres close their doors permanently. It's potentially a scorched earth situation.
And I suppose, and there's a side of that which sort of links back to the earlier part of the conversation about the right to roam, that right to access arts and culture is a human right. And with those buildings closing, there's no spaces for work to go. There'll be communities that will have to travel great distances to access the arts. There'll be some communities that won't have arts locally. And that, of course, will have a huge impact on who gets to engage in the arts. And, you know, if you don't live in a big city, you might find it harder to get to see the arts. And
it's much harder to build something once it's been knocked down. It will be really easy to let a lot of things collapse over the next months and perhaps years. And they need support to not collapse, and rebuilding them afterwards if they collapse will cost a great deal more in time, effort and money than it will cost to sustain them through the crisis. But I loved what you just said. I hadn't quite seen that immediacy of the analogy between those two rights to access. That's immediately obvious, but also that kind of synthesis of those two things. You know, that those workers' movements in the 1930s that were campaigning for the right to access the countryside, that led directly to the creation of national parks immediately after the Second World War. And either the same year or the year after also saw the creation of the Arts Council, and it emerges out of exactly the same or heavily overlapping Venn diagrams, at least, of movements of working people who want the right to access the best of everything that's available and cannot understand why they would not have that right. And everything that was built in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, we could include the NHS in that as well. We've had all of those things since then, to the extent that a lot of them begin to be taken for granted. Yeah. And that makes it possible to quietly erode some of those rights and some of those accesses. So just like with the right to access the countryside, we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go.
I just want to thank you for spending some time talking to me about this, and I'm going to start recording now, but it's been really a real pleasure to talk to you. Do you have news of whether the show will tour again?
Yeah, So quite a lot of the tour dates have been rescheduled rather than cancelled. And we already had some tour dates in the diary for this autumn. So most of the rescheduling has been for kind of the early part of next year. We're at a place at the moment where we don't know when theatres are going to reopen, and certainly seems likely that theatres and arts organisations more generally will be among the last things to reopen, which is part of why there's a real worry that many will not be able to survive up until that point. But we have dates in the diary. Not all of the tour dates that we'd originally booked have been put back in the diary, but we certainly hope that most, if not all of them, will. We just can't say for certain when that's going to happen. But yeah, look out in the autumn or the early part of next year, or if necessary, we'll reschedule again. But we've every intention of getting the show out there just as soon as it's possible for people to gather together in a room once again.
Thank you so much for chatting to me. I'm going to stop recording now. Thanks again.
You're welcome.